depends. Like Canadians don't bring back their war dead from Europe or other places. They're buried there in what we call consecrated ground, like the cemeteries in Holland from World War II, Vimy, Passchendaele. Most of them have been ceded to Canada. They're little parts of Canada. The countries have given them to us. So it's like you're buried on Canadian soil, but you're in France, you're in Holland. But of course, the actual bodies weren't brought back. And what people don't realize, World War I was over a third of the people killed weren't even identified. And you always hear about the tomb of the unknown soldier, etc. That's because literally a third of bodies were never identified. There was no body to bury or bring back or have a marker for. And again, when you think back of the time, the 19 teens, and the Boer War before that, people were very religious in the sense of that physical body was very important to them because they really believed in like the resurrection. That physical body was going to literally get up at the resurrection, be reconstituted with the family, and whatever happens after that, if you're a good person, bad person. So throughout the cemetery, like with the Rileys honoring their son killed at Passchendaele, this is very similar. This boy here killed at Vimy Ridge in 1917. So his family would have put a marker here of some type. He's not buried here himself. He's just he has no marker. He's not known where he was physically, you know, doesn't have a physical body that was buried. Probably was blown apart or whatnot. But here's the marker to Fred. And I mentioned the thing is, he's called Old because his sister, she used to always call him Old because he was so serious, they said. As a youth, you want to become a naturalist, a biologist, and learn about nature, just like in a nature lover. But at 21, he was killed at Vimy Ridge. And throughout the cemetery, you'll find all types of little markers and memorials to people killed at the time. Apparently, in southern Alberta, and probably the rest of Canada, but in the war years, the whole of this area pretty much came to a stop because almost every able-bodied young male was overseas in Europe at the time. And there was 40,000 Albertans who went over, and just over 60% were wounded or killed of those. So the casualty rate was really high, like it was super duper high. So you had less than a 50% chance of coming back the way you left. You might have come back, but you were shot or something happened to you like this. So really, really high casualties. And Signal Hill, you know Signal Hill with the numbers on top, you see by the shopping center. That was put there by a couple of the regiments, battalions at World War I. And I forget the numbers, but it's something like there was 280 men in that battalion and only 60 some came back when you see those numbers up there. They were put up there. So the casualty rate was just horrific. And almost every family in Calgary had either a son or a brother or someone seriously wounded or killed in Europe at that time. So it just dominated the city. You know, this is every single family. This isn't like somebody down the street. This is your own family, you know, had someone killed.
So how come the bodies weren't brought back, like the ones that were okay? Was it too costly at that time? That's why?
Yeah, and plus, just the logistics of it. There's so many. We're talking thousands, you know, we're talking, you know, World War I, we're talking over 50,000 Canadians.
Oh, okay.
You know, so yeah, it was just logistics of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they were buried over there, and often a marker put in the cemetery here, or a marker with the family on their family tombstone put here. Oh, here's another. So we saw John Ware right here, cowboy. If you go to K Country, there's Ware Creek, a place named after him too. There's a few spots in K Country. And you got John Ware's buddy, or they all probably knew each other. There weren't that many guys who stayed and ranched. Sam Livingston, famous Calgarian. Some people call him the very first Calgarian. It's always debated who was the first Calgarian. Who knows? As far as a citizen, not finding Calgary, but an actual citizen. And Sam Livingston was quite a character. He wore if you look at photos of him, go to Google, he's got a little buckskin on, and his wife looks, you know, similar. Right out of like Davy Crockett type era. That's what he looks like. And he's from a place in Scotland called Glenmore. We all know the word Glenmore, Glenmore Trail, Glenmore Park. Well, that's
Glenmore
thanks
Reservoir.
to Sam Livingston. He did the same as John Ware. He got his stake, his riches we'll call it at that time. He brought horses in from the Kootenay in BC, the Kootenay Lakes area, wild horses, the same thing as John Ware, and brought his horses into Calgary and sold them or used some of them and started his ranch out on today's Glenmore Reservoir area. And like Louise Riley, he thought, well, you know, kids should be educated. So even before Louise Riley, he started the first school in Calgary that wasn't a mission school, like a Catholic priest school. So he started the first, we'll call it a public school for all children in Calgary.
Wow.
And he was sort of the headmaster, except there was only one issue. He wasn't literate. But he would never really admit it, but people knew he wasn't. And neither was John Ware, by the way. Didn't mean there were any, they never had the opportunity, of course, to go to school. So he's from Ireland, this guy. Glenmore is in Ireland. And he was illiterate, so here he's like sort of the headmaster. So he had his wife, who was literate, become the teacher. She was the teacher. Of course, no formal training. And they took children in to teach them, whatever that meant in the 1890s or something like that, whatever the first school in Calgary. So it's pretty neat, you know, you go to school and you're thinking of a principal, you know, like, well, he's not literate, well, what the heck, you know. If you go to Heritage Park, they have another monument to Livingston, and they have his house there, I think, something like that, in the old schoolroom, the first schoolroom or something like that, one of the buildings, started by Sam Livingston. So he is quite the character. And you see he's got the old scruffy beard down here, and all the leather on, and, you know, rifle in his hand like this, you know, just a real pioneer. You'll see the odd tombstone that's on its end like this, like I said before. Modern cemeteries have this weird thing that they give a push test. And if a stone's going to fall, they proactively lay it down. This started in England about a decade ago because a couple of people every year are killed by falling tombstones.
Oh, okay.
But of course, their cemetery is a lot older.
Yep.
So they actually
The
have a
tombstones are
test
bigger.
now where they actually push the tombstone. Then they lay it down until someone can fix it. Oh, Prince's Island. Two things he's named for: Prince's Island and Eau Claire. You know Eau Claire? Because good story. He's from Eau Claire, Michigan, and it was always debated. What does the word Calgary mean? It's a Gaelic word. There's a little tiny castle village in Scotland called Calgary. And for years and years, even when I was a kid, you say, what did Calgary mean? People thought it meant clear water.
That's what I was told.
Yeah? And Eau Claire, French, is clear water. He's from Eau Claire, except he's an American. Eau Claire. And there was sort of a bit of a rift between the British, English, and the Americans coming up here. It was okay if you're John Ware, you're a cowboy, you work like this, but they didn't always like the American businessmen coming up here. There was a real divide between the two in the city. There was us and them, those upstart Americans. You know, how dare they come in? You know, Calgary's trying to be more British and Scotch than Britain was, like Victoria, British Columbia. This was always the thing. We play cricket here. We have high tea. We do these types of things. The Americans come and they're trying to Americanize us. They're too crass. So he wanted his town, he wanted his lumber mill where Eau Claire is today named Eau Claire after where he was from. And he kind of said, oh yeah, it's clear water, just like Calgary. So they accepted calling the area Eau Claire because it was like Calgary, meaning clear water. But then since then, a little bit more digging into the name Calgary, and it's actually thought to mean sunny beach, ocean beach. Which is funny for Scotland.
Yeah.
But that's what the Gaelic word they think now means, the sunny ocean beach. Doesn't mean clear water. So he got his way. So we got Prince's Island and Eau Claire named after him. And we talked about marriage. He was married 3 times. 2 of his wives are here, but one wife was Catholic. So she's married. She's buried in the Catholic cemetery, way over there somewhere by the St. Mary's Church. Yeah, by the church down here, I think somewhere. There's a little Catholic area down there. Mission. Yeah.
In Mission.
Yeah, somewhere down there. Yeah. So even though that's a case of her being Catholic, they prefer her not to be buried in the Protestant cemetery.
Good.
Okay, so the old sandstone marker, how they're developing. Yeah, just how they're all slowly falling apart.
So this one's the sandstone.
This is one of the few areas.
White stone and the black
Yeah.
stone. Black stone for the black people. or white
Yeah, right. Who knows? Yeah. You know, they were a funny bunch because they would read stuff into everything. You know, they had all types of. They get their nose out of joint. And oh, the other thing to remember too. This is 1890s when this just started, and this is a small town out here. And literacy wasn't a big thing, so, and I don't know exactly which one, but there'll be spelling mistakes on some markers because no one really noticed. You know, like, people didn't really pick up on it. I have no idea who Leeson is. I'm not even too sure. But this is probably about, if this is another cemetery, you notice this how plain this is. This is pretty much probably what they're allowed to get away with in Calgary at the time. Beyond this would be too ornate for their cemetery. And you'd be competing too much with the guy above or something like this. So that's probably as fancy as you got. If you go to another cemetery elsewhere, this would probably be, you know, fleur-de-lis or something, or curly cues and little things like that. But no, that's what you could have here, very plain, simple. That would be acceptable probably. I don't know who they're keeping out. Catholics, I guess. Yeah. And it's not how certain names, there'll be, through the cemetery, there'll be a whole area of certain last names, but you never really hear about them for some reason. You don't know, just some people just never came to prominence, or they didn't do anything really bad. These are nice people. Yeah, low on the radar. Pretty much all Scottish. They come most of the way from Scotland itself, including Colonel MacLeod, came out for the Empire, do their duty, whatnot. But what's neat though is later on, he didn't only work, he worked for the railway coming through, the Grand Trunk Railway, but he also went out to Saskatchewan, today's Cypress Hills, and worked as what they call the Indian agent out there for the government. And after the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana, when Custer was defeated, Sitting Bull had the fleet. He came up to Canada into Saskatchewan, and we'll call the word surrender, isn't quite the right word. Let's say he presented himself to the Canadian government, asked for sanctuary in Canada, and James Colvin is the one who's Sitting Bull. He accepted Sitting Bull's plea for some type of sanctuary in our country. So they put up Sitting Bull and his Sioux warriors and the families for one winter and fed them. And they negotiated with the American government to give them sanctuary back in the United States, where they were put on reserves eventually. So he accepted sort of, we won't call Sitting Bull's surrender because he never surrendered, his negotiation to get a deal with the American government. That's pretty neat. You know, the guy comes up with Colonel McLeod helps find Calgary. Then a few years later, he's accepting this negotiation with Sitting Bull. Probably just a regular guy from Scotland, some little village somewhere. That's where he grew up, you know. Finds himself in the middle of nowhere doing these things. And most of us, you're probably too young or would know F Troop. There was a. Yeah, tell us, Meredith. Tell us.
We just watched the reruns, right?
There was, most of you wouldn't know, but back in the late 60s in Canada, it's an American show. There was a show called F Troop. But F Troop was American cavalry, not Canadian cavalry. And they're like, you know, Gomer Pyle, Beverly Hillbillies? Well, F Troop was this bumbling cavalry group. And it was called F Troop. So whenever anyone older sees F Troop, right away you think of like the equivalent of the Beverly Hillbillies almost. These sort of, you know, crazy cavalry guys who can't do anything right. And the Indians are always taking care of them. You know? Oh, here, let's go up here a sec. So we're on the high point almost of the whole cemetery. Up here is all these hills. This is sort of the first area that was sort of, people were planted, we'll use that word. And of course, at the center of life, again, we don't think of today, was the church, Presbyterian church. So at the very top of the hill is the highest point. Of course, you bury your first minister, gets buried here. He gets like the prime spot. And so over on here, a good Scottish name, Angus. Can't get more Scottish than that. So he came here 1883. This supposedly is one of the first graves here, official graves in Union Cemetery. And apparently he was a real dour Presbyterian too. He was every, you know, Bible thumping, you know, thunder and lightning, this type of thing. No nonsense. Probably some people weren't too sad when he left this earth a little early. you know. But again, it's the highest point on the hill. You know, that's reserved for the minister. And the reason that's kind of important, again, it gives you a sense of, you have all these other becoming wealthy ranchers and that, but still the minister gets the high spot because the church is really prominent at that time. It's what the community revolves around. And the Catholic community revolves around Mission, St. Mary's and Mission, and the Father Lacombe and all this type of thing. So the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, they're really the center of the city. It's not the politicians. It's not even the famous ranchers you hear about starting to stampede. The most powerful people in town is still the church at that time.
So do you think this is a historical grave? And do you think, because it's deteriorating from the sandstone, that the Historical Society will do something with it to preserve, or?
Yeah, I'm sure, because they all loved him. No, yeah, they will. Yeah, they'll. There's a good case here. The one right here, someone's another sandstone when you can't read anymore.
Yeah.
And you know, anyone not from Canada, where you're used to older cemeteries, and cemeteries be 2,000 years old, 1,000 years old. You can't read anything, like this. And it depends a lot on the group that's here, like what group. We'll say running the things. Like when I was a kid growing up in Europe, and that they've been neglected cemeteries because that group no longer really the power group. Where things like this. And his wife died. Went to be a missionary in China. And she died on the way back, I think, of typhoid or diphtheria or something. It's very common at the time. Yeah, on the ship. And that's what's mentioned in the literature, but who knows? She could die of something. I think people have to put down consumption, typhoid, and I'm sure a lot of those ships at the time they weren't too particular. They weren't too, typhoid, dysentery. They just put something on the death certificate, and that was pretty much it.
She was like 50 or something. Almost 60. 60-ish. Yeah, so that was a good age, wasn't it, too, back then?
Yes.
Hey Ray, why do we have a lot of these stakes here?
Oh, good question. Raza makes a good. I really encourage you to come back and do a little bit of reading on the cemetery, and read a bunch of sources, because every time you hear a story like I'm telling or something else, you'll read something different. So it's good to get different perspectives. So it's good just if you see a name, you're wandering around and see a bunch of names, just Google early Calgary, the last name. Like the one over here we saw, Leeson. I don't know what that is. I'm kind of curious now. Anyway, and these are the markers that mark out the cemetery, like in districts and rows. So you can go, and sometimes I'll mention they're buried at a certain spot in the cemetery. Just make a note of the coordinates here.
Sections
Then you can
and
find
Section
blocks.
B and
Stone.
Block 8.
the first time I came here a couple of years ago, I was completely confused trying to find things because of the hills.
Yeah.
And you think you're just going to walk to the cemetery and someone says, well, it's on the hill over here near something. But when you get in here, after 2,000 graves, you just can't find anything anymore.
Yeah.
Or you can't go back to them. You found it, you can't find it again. So it's good to make a note of the coordinates.